Colin Goodykoontz was a historian, a professor at this university from 1921 to 1954, and teaching emeritus until his death in 1958. And really, I think saying that is almost saying enough. He taught, he read, he researched, he thought. He lacked the historical ambition, the world-shaking drive of his mentor, Frederick Jackson Turner, but maybe that's better put the other way around. Goodykoontz was suspicious of mountain-topping ambitions and Turner's kind of grand attempt to forge a legacy of national acclaim. The spiritual child of New England's Puritanism, influenced perhaps by a more Midwestern pietism, he lived a deliberately small life of quietude and thrift, thinking it enough to save scraps of paper for notes, recycle glass bottles, and drive his old Studebaker long past its sell-by date. Student legend held that he never got above second gear in his errands around town. His financial records show constant charitable giving, and his will left $20,000, over $200,000 in today's money, to Norland Library. Along the way, he taught, he read, he researched, he thought. I don't know what else one could want from an intellectual man of moral seriousness. It was, I think, an admirable life. I came to know of him a decade ago when, commissioned to write about religion in the frontier-era West, I discovered that Colin Goodykoontz was one of the few who had gathered some of this scattered material, leading to his major work, the 1939 book, The Home Missionary Movement in the West, 1798 to 1861. When the Benson Center invited me to fill a visiting chair here at the University of Colorado, I remembered that this had been the home of the neglected Goodykoontz. So I decided, as a small thank you to the university for hosting me, that I would spend a little time in the archives, do some desultory research, and give a small presentation about the man's life and career, one of those light things about an old professor that might appear in, say, a college alumni magazine. But along the way, here in Boulder, I've gained a newfound friendship with the historian Patricia Limerick, and she grew interested in the project when I mentioned that a CU predecessor of hers had been a protege of Frederick Jackson Turner at Harvard. Turner is, how shall I put this, Limerick's target, perhaps, her sounding board, her windmill successfully charged with a long lance in her prize-winning 1987 book, The Legacy of Conquest. And so she took to the idea of joining me today to talk about Goodykoontz, turning my light thank you gift into something more substantial and serious. It prompted, for example, the observation that despite Goodykoontz's example, religion remains an understudied element of Western history even today. That's something we clearly need to think about. Why is Christianity so little present in current accounts of the conquest of the New World? We have not just the example of Goodykoontz, but the towering figure of Francis Parkman, another Harvard professor, whose 1849 The Oregon Trail Sketches of Prairie and Rocky Mountain Life was, when I was young, one of those texts you were expected to have read if you were an educated American. We can forget his stature, but here's one small recent measure. Parkman's work formed the 11th and 12th volumes published by the Library of America after only the likes of Melville, Hawthorne, Whitman, and Harriet Beecher Stowe. And the second installment of Parkman's massive history of France and England in the New World was the 1867 classic, The Jesuits in North America in the 17th Century. The professional rendering of American history, in other words, was in its early days much concerned with religion. I could mention here Jan Ships, the wonderful non-Mormon historian of Mormonism who died just last spring. She earned her PhD here at the University of Colorado in 1965, which gives yet another link for us here at the school to the question of religion in the West. But let me take a literary turn to the trio of great puzzle of America novels in the 1920s. F. Scott Fitzgerald's 1925 The Great Gatsby, Theodore Dreiser's An American Tragedy that same year, and Willa Cather's 1927 Death Comes for the Archbishop. As it turns out, these were all concerned with the clash of East and West, and they all hovered on the edge of religion, God-haunted, in Flannery O'Connor's wonderful phrase. Thus, for example, religion appears in the lapsed Catholic Fitzgerald's novel as God's overlooking eyes in the faded billboard for the optometrist T.J. Eckelberg, and the narrator remembers as innocent and moral the Christmas sleigh bells of his Midwest home, markedly different from the sophisticated manners and immoralities of the East. The West, too, is always on the edge of Fitzgerald's story until the final chapter concludes, I can see now that this has been a story of the West, after all. Tom and Gatsby, Daisy and Jordan and I were all Westerners, and perhaps we possessed some deficiency in common, which made us subtly unadaptable to Eastern life. Dreiser, another Catholic, has Clyde Griffiths, his central character, begin as the son of Protestant street preachers in the new cities of the West and end up executed for murder in upstate New York. The only one of this trio, this great trio of puzzle of America novels to finish on any kind of optimistic note, and the only one set in the Deep West, is the Protestant Cather's very Catholic book, Death Comes for the Archbishop. I go through periods of thinking it the great American novel before I fall back on Hawthorne. But regardless, Death Comes for the Archbishop is an amazingly stylized composition, a fictionalized recasting of the lives of two Frenchmen come to the mountains, Jean-Baptiste Lamy, the first Archbishop of Santa Fe, and Joseph Machabouf, the first Bishop of Denver. Cather's linking of religion in the West in the fate of America is explicit, detailed, and profoundly meant. Before we turn to the vexed question of what Frederick Jackson Turner had to say on this topic, let me add a few more words about Colin Goodykoontz. Born in Indiana in 1885, the son of a Congregationalist pastor, he began college at Indiana University, but he fell prey as an undergraduate to a pulmonary disease, probably pneumonia, and like many others, he came west to restore his health in a drier air. Joining his relocated parents in Boulder, he would enroll at the local university, where he blossomed as an academic star, graduating in 1912. The recommendation of his CU professor, James Willard, basically, if you were around at that time, you got a building named after you on campus. The recommendation of his CU professor, James Willard, sent Goodykoontz to Cal Berkeley, where he studied with Herbert Eugene Bolton. As it happens, the prolific and energetic Bolton disagreed with Turner's frontier thesis, arguing that America is better understood as a product of all the different nations exploring the New World. Goodykoontz would write his master's thesis in Bolton's field on Spanish exploration of the territories adjacent to New Spain. From there, Goodykoontz went to Harvard to do his doctoral work under Turner, graduating in 1921, whereupon Willard helped bring him back to Boulder as a new history professor. His later correspondence with Turner, held here in the Norland Library archives, is not particularly revealing of his or Turner's thought, except perhaps for letters about Turner's attempts to have him join the board of the relatively new and massively endowed Huntington Library in Southern California, which Goodykoontz resisted. Turner wanted an ally to promote his interests in the library, and Goodykoontz wanted, well, to live smaller than that. He served as acting dean in 1925 and again in 1928 during the illness of the long-serving dean F.B.R. Helms. Did I mention that if you were in that generation before Goodykoontz, you got a building? And he was chair of the history department for a single term, but because he intensely disliked administrative work. He always filled his duties, both because he had a strong sense of duty and because he felt the need to support the university, but he fled them as soon as he could, refusing appointment as permanent dean. A deeply committed Protestant, he felt his fellowship in the First Congregational Church of Boulder required him to write a small history of that church and to organize its records. Growing interested in specifically Colorado history, Goodykoontz and his now colleague Willard edited a 1926 volume called Experiments in Colorado Colonization. In 1941, he published a book on the radical Senator Edward P. Costigan and the progressive movement in Colorado. But he would later say he was perhaps proudest of having organized a major historical conference in 1929, something that became foundational for work on the Trans-Mississippi West. It was at this Boulder conference, for instance, that Walter Prescott Webb first presented his theory of land, water, and timber, the three legs of Western industry, expanded in his 1931 book, The Great Plains. In 1953, Goodykoontz gave an interesting presidential address to the Pacific Coast branch of the American Historical Association on knowledge of history at the time of the Revolution. But I want to look at a different late honor he received. In 1954, the year of his retirement, he was chosen to deliver the annual faculty research lecture here on that campus, titled Westward, Controls Over the American Frontier. This is, I think, the most mature presentation of his thought after a lifetime of research and contemplation in the field. But to understand that, we have to return to that man, that towering figure, that bugaboo, Frederick Jackson Turner, and his wildly influential 1893 paper, The Significance of the Frontier in American History. American democracy was born of no theorist's dream, he wrote, or overwrote. Turner was always something of a hyperbolist. Democracy, he said, came out of the American forest, and it gained new strength each time it touched a new frontier. A few years after her legacy of conquest, Patty Limerick returned to the man in a 1995 essay called Tunerians All. And while she continued to demolish the frontier thesis that had made Turner famous, she noted the many small passages in his work that offered caveats and counter-theses. The first thought that occurred to me while reading Patty's essay recently was how accurately she describes the profession's inability to banish Turner from public awareness. He is taken as a classic, she said, and thus somehow exempt. Certainly that was my own experience decades ago. I'm not a historian, at most an amateur with an interest in the history of ideas, and I read Turner the way I read Francis Parkman, or, to take more extreme examples, the way I read Gibbon and Thucydides. Not as conveyors of what modern professional history demands, but as monuments in the history of literature, as instances of culture, as markers in the flow of art and ideas. Do snarly corrections of errors in Gibbon dismantle the prose and cultural effect of the 18th century decline and fall of the Roman Empire? Is Thucydides undone when we catalog his mistakes? If you answer yes to such questions, you're a professional historian, a modern academic. If you answer no, when I answer no, I mark myself as just a reader. In the cases of Parkman and Turner, a reader of the felicities and foibles in classic writing about this wild, bizarre, unpredictable country of ours. In her 1995 essay, however, Patty also comments that Turner sacrifices drama in his story of the frontier. Event follows event, she says, with all the spontaneity of the prearranged program of the Rose Bowl parade. But in his 1954 faculty lecture, Goodykoontz made clear that as far back as his PhD dissertation, he had picked up a source of tension in Turner, noting the love of adventure in some people, a line, it seems to me, susceptible to an Aristotelian reading of thumos, of spiritedness in human nature. Turner wrote as an aside in his Frontier paper that the East has always feared the result of an unregulated advance of the frontier and has tried to check and guide it. By that, Turner almost certainly meant federal law. But he does go on to mention religion. He quotes the great Presbyterian abolitionist preacher Lyman Beecher, father, we might note, of Harriet Beecher Stowe, to the effect that, quote, the religious and political destiny of our nation is to be decided in the West. Basically, everyone in the 19th century was a great rhetorician. Even more to the point, he quotes a worried Beecher before his death in 1863 on the rapidity of Western growth. What will become of the West, Beecher asked, if our prosperity rushes up to such a majesty of power, while those great institutions which are necessary to form the mind and the conscience and the heart of that vast world, while all that lingers? It must not be permitted. And Goodykoontz grasped these hints to construct his own account of an East and West at odds, not just the controls attempted by the government, but in the efforts of the churches, which, lacking coercive legal power, had to control the West with personal suasion, education, and moral theology. This is why Goodykoontz would look to the Congregationalist and Presbyterian home mission movement in his major book. Goodykoontz came by this interest honestly. In 1883, a man named Colin Goodykoontz, an itinerant preacher who was, I believe, our Colin's grandfather, described one town in the Indiana in which his grandson would be born 52 years later as consisting chiefly of ignorance and her squalid brood, a universal dearth of intellect, total abstinence from literature, croaking jealousy, bloated bigotry, coiling suspicion, wormish blindness, crocodile malice. And so our own Colin, our little remembered forebear here at CU Boulder, began his 1954 lecture with a set of questions. Why has the East been at odds with the West? What efforts have been made to control the advance of the frontier? How effective were those checks on frontiersmen? The effort to rein in the West, he thought, in opposition to Turner's emphasis on government control of borders, treaties, and finance, was far more emblematically expressed in the church's attempts to combat the irregular and illiterate roll-your-own theology of the frontier, to establish schools, to promote civility, and to save souls. Whatever the motives, Goodykoontz told the CU Boulder faculty that day in 1954, one of the most significant aspects of American Protestantism in the 19th century was the attempt of the various denominations to keep up with the expanding frontier. That clash, the imposing and the resisting of control, was drama enough, I think. It fed the narrative of different worlds that Fitzgerald, Dreiser, and Cather employed as they puzzled about America in the 1920s. For that matter, it opened Western history to something more than just a Tunerian goo of noble, freedom-loving frontier folk creating democracy on the march in their moccasins and buckskins on one side of historiography, and on the other side, a grim account of industry and corrupt finance running over Indians and small frontier farmers alike. Colin Goodykoontz, the gentle, pious CU Boulder teacher we need to remember, knew there was more to the story. He saw that God-fearing and church-going built the West as much as lumbermen, railroad tycoons, and greedy politicians with their hands out. He felt the clash of East and West from Harvard to Colorado, and in his quiet way, he tried to tell us about it. Thank you.
Just stay seated in a sort of chatty mode because I will have to rethink some of the things I have written here. So it's better to do that seated than standing. I think I'm faster enough. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity, and I will get to the fact that in Helms Hall, before it was remodeled, there was a Goodykoontz seminar room, and I walked by that several, well, 10,000 times probably, and I never thought, who's that? Because historians don't really do history much of the time. We're just sort of like, oh, there's a name on a door. Well, I guess we'll just walk past that. So that seems very odd to me, that I wouldn't have stopped to think. And then I'm going to throw something in here that I didn't even actually put in my notes, but really should be here because it explains what a personalized universe I live in. So when I came here for my job interview, there was another woman here, and she was being interviewed for a colonial history position. And not to give too much away too fast here, but she was Frederick Jackson Turner's granddaughter-in-law. Gloria Main was a colonial American historian, still with us in her 90s, and she was, well, Turner's granddaughter-in-law. Her children, Jackson Turner Main, her husband had retired, so I've never had really more than a week without being around a Turner descendant. And my house has been filled with Turners. I mean, it's Turner descendants, they have different last names now, but it's just such an interesting thing to have that whole personal tie. And there's Frederick Jackson Turner's granddaughter-in-law and grandson walking down the hall, and none of us saying, who is this Goodykoontz guy? You have something to do with all these Turners. So just an interesting thing now, and part of the fun of being here is that sort of, oh. And I did write Turner descendants today and sent them an announcement to say we're talking about, I think I said ancestral ties on the subject line there. So, okay, we're going to get a little bit more into that, how everything seems to be so oddly intertwined and congruent and intersecting. And after hearing this, I have no idea what the relationship was between Goodykoontz and his mentor. I am completely at sea on that. But I will go ahead with what I thought I was figuring out, and then we'll find out how poorly I figured that out. I want to start, though, with a question none of us can answer, or maybe you can because you've been to the archives, was Colin Goodykoontz, was he a fan of Mark Twain? We don't know. Okay, too bad, because he would have loved one of the best Mark Twain, how could we ever rank order those, but Mark Twain had a story about how one day his wife, Livy, was pushing him to go to church and listen to a visiting missionary. And the missionary was going to talk about his work adventures, his passion, his commitment, and then there would be some money collected. And Mark Twain did not want to go. Well, Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain didn't want to go. But Livy pushed, and so he went. Well, the missionary was introduced, and the missionary was really a good speaker. It's kind of entrancing. And so Twain really shifted and thought, oh, I'm so glad I came. And then he felt bad because he had brought $1, $2. And this was so moving and so intense that he thought, oh, I should have brought more money. How can I possibly? So he started looking around the congregation for people he knew who he could borrow money from. And so finally he found someone and managed to quietly get, now he had $5. Oh, but it was so good. The missionary was speaking so wonderfully that Twain had to find somebody else, and then he was up to 10, finds up to 25. And then the missionary keeps talking, and the missionary keeps talking, and the missionary keeps talking. And Twain says, by the time he finished, I was feeling so mean and nasty, I stole a quarter for the collection plate. So I wish Colin Goodykoontz could have heard that story. I think he would have found that particularly interesting, particularly amusing, because one of the things I want to get to is how apparently his archives, the archives that were available to him on the missionary society he was studying, were just enormous. So he knew that missionaries would just, it's a wonder they had time to pray. They wanted to write so much to tell people what they were doing. They wanted to talk to people about what they were doing. So the Twain story, in my opinion, really kind of tells us something about the archives that Goodykoontz got into. So, okay, so that's interesting to me, to think of what an enormous source Goodykoontz had. And I would have thought that was the determinant of him not being able to comply with his mentor. What could that mean? Okay, I thought he was going to be a devoted protégé. And at least one reviewer thought that as well, and remarked on Goodykoontz's determination to show Turner's work and play. And then, as I read more and more, I do have this written out, but I think I'm going to, the stuff that I wanted to get to is a little bit less on this notion that I thought Goodykoontz wanted to be a good, loyal Turnerian protege, and I thought he failed at that because the archives were too rich and too complex, and it just was not possible to do the soaring, grandiose, overgeneralization mode. He had to do something else. So, but now what you're saying is quite a bit more interesting, that he just went on a different route of saying there's more to the story. So what I was going to do, and I will skip over this. People love it when you go over pages fast and you read them. People love that. I've seen that with audiences. So, okay, so what I would like to say here is that I never paid much attention. I paid no attention to the division between missionaries going to the West to redeem white settlers and missionaries going to the West to convert and transform Indian people. I had not realized that institutionally those were such different people. So I knew about the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missionaries because they had sent Marcus and Narcissa Whitman to the Pacific Northwest. They'd been very big figures in that. But I had not realized how separate that was from the Home Missionary Society. So we've got two contesting, well, probably maybe more than that. One group of missionaries are going to go save settlers from themselves, and the others are going to try to convert Indian people. And those are two different organizations, and it never occurred to me to think about that. Should have. Presbyterians and Congregationalists were key to both of them. And that's where this whole complexity that could not be Turnerian, because Turnerian really means big generalizations. Okay, here's a line that is very well written, so I'm going to read that one. Presbyterians and Congregationalists may have both been Protestants, but interdenominational solidarity and trust did not always register in either group's articles of faith. I think that's actually quite well written, but you don't have to agree with that. Anyway, it's just interesting to see how that was not a unified group of people, the missionaries. They could certainly, the American Board of Foreign Missionaries, we know that with the Whitmans. The Whitmans and 4 or 5 other couples went to the Pacific Northwest. They were at each other's throats in no time at all. They were, they were certainly probably, I guess they pulled themselves together and disliked Catholics more than they disliked each other, but I think it was a narrow contest. So the intensity of divisiveness in these circles is quite something, and that's why I thought that the complexity of the topic made it, and the complexity of the sources and the cast of characters, he couldn't be Turnerian. He couldn't, because they just were not giving him supporting material. It was such clashing things. So a reviewer, historian of religion, named Charles T. Thrift, Jr., he offered this summary of Goodykoontz's, first of all, he says, he quotes Goodykoontz saying that the theme of his book was the organized effort of Protestants in the older parts of the United States to carry religious and educational institutions to the inhabitants of the frontier regions. And that could be almost in line with Turner's frontier thesis. But, okay, here's the summary that Thrift gives us of what Goodykoontz ended up with. He finds the motivations for the East Home Missionary effort in 5 things. Keep track of it. Denominational rivalry among Protestants is listed first, but an even stronger motive is found in the fear of the spread of Roman Catholicism. The tendency towards emotional excesses in the religion of the West likewise was a cause for concern in the older settlements of the country. The ignorance and illiteracy of the frontier preachers, especially the Baptists and Methodists, is listed as the 4th cause of concern to the East, while the final reason is found in the belief that frontier ministers were often more concerned with such secular pursuits as farming and land speculation than in spreading the gospel. Okay, first thing there, denominational rivalry. well, this is turning into a complicated story right there, just to go back to the, and again, here's the Presbyterians and Congregationalists in deep dismay over the Baptists and Methodists. So, okay, so all of this is a long-winded way of saying Professor Goodykoontz picked a topic that, with its swirl of complexity, made it certain that he would have a hard time validating and ratifying his mentor's simple thesis. But in some ways, I really prefer your notion that he just said there's more to the story and was sort of driven more by narrative recognition. Instead, it just seems to me that he wanted to be loyal to his mentor, and the sources wouldn't let him, but I think I prefer his story on that. So I'll just say for myself, I feel more tied to what I'm talking about than I expected to. Late in my career as a Western American historian, I find myself pondering the ever-deepening mystery raised by two questions. Who were the settlers who drove westward expansion, and are we ever going to get anywhere in understanding their beliefs and their actions? Tentative answer, we're not. They're so mystifying, they're so complicated, and they're so divided against each other sometimes, and then united every now and then, not for very long. They have motives ranging from the most crassly economic to the most elevated. By the way, I should tell you, there's a whole important line of research in Western history that says that very few of the settlers actually used the phrase manifest destiny. Very few of the settlers actually said, God is behind us in this cause. The people making that argument say that the desire to acquire land was far more compelling than any religious notion on that, or any religious notions they had were not particularly tied to this phrase manifest destiny, that was a Democratic journalist in New York in the 1840s who used that term. People didn't particularly pick it up. People who picked it up, it's a wonderful young man who's written an article called Manifest Mirth about how much humor was used to mock the people who did use the phrase manifest destiny. This fellow opens with a story where a member of Congress who did believe in manifest destiny was giving a speech in the late 1840s, and he was making a full-out case for God supporting the whole enterprise of westward expansion, and he was greeted by gales of laughter from the other members of Congress. So somehow my people got a little bit confused over that over the years, and we have endless high school classes. Every high school class, every textbook, college as well, has a chapter on manifest destiny. And now we have these irritating younger people who just go out and look at sources and just end up saying, we can't show the absence of the phrase, but we can show how rarely it seems to have been used in the sources. So, okay, so that's pretty interesting. The settlers are bewildering. To me, the settler descendants are bewildering. They are such a complicated group that I'm hesitant to even use that category, as if if I hadn't just gone through this routine and I said, I'm going to say a few words about settlers, you would all have seen the Prairie Madonna, you would all have had an image come up of the person I was speaking of on that. But now we hardly know them. They're strangers to us, and I think that's actually very much in their interest, that they are far more engaging and stimulating when they are complex. So the fact that Goodykoontz's summary starts with the summary of his work starts with a denominational rivalry, well, that's par for the course. They are so refusing to go into any simple categorization for us. They are so determined to mock any historian who tries to overgeneralize about them. So that's okay. That's what I thought was the tension. Goodykoontz had to pay attention to the complexity of settlers, which then had to cause him to pay attention to the complexity of relationships with the East with those settlers, and that's why he couldn't be Turnerian, but now I see that there are different reasons for that. But now, here's the main action here. I am now going to perform in public a demonstration of the intellectual gymnastic event called Mixed Judgment. I'm very aware that the Olympics are going now, and there is no competition taking place in this particular sport, but it's a strenuous sport. You will be kind of Olympics-style judges, deciding how you'll rate my agility on a balance beam. Basically, is what I'm going to try now, is a balance beam in talking about Goodykoontz. So, I shall first state that I am proud to claim Colin Goodykoontz as my predecessor in the discipline of history at the University of Colorado and in the nation. And I will state why, and then after I explain that why I'm proud, I will state why I also cringe when I make that claim. And I will admit that I indulge in the pointless wish that Professor Goodykoontz had invested just a little small amount of time in a reconnaissance of his blind spots. Okay, the pride in my predecessor part first. Totally, since both of these are very sincere convictions, these are not, one is not prevailing over the other. In 1953, and Jody referred to this, Colin Goodykoontz was the president of the American Historical Association's Pacific Coast Branch, and in his presidential speech, he explored the uses of history, or as he put it, their relationship to the muse of history, Cleo. He explored the use of history by the writers of the U.S. Constitution. As a certified conference animal, I have heard a lot of presidential speeches at historian conventions, and I can say with some authority that the speakers often see this as an opportunity simply to let the audience contemplate the rigor and thoroughness of the speaker's research. I did not know what to expect when I started into reading this presidential speech, though I probably expected that. This leads directly to my pride in the predecessor performance of Mixed Judgment. I was surprised and grateful to discover that Professor Colin Goodykoontz used his presidential address to cast the nation's founders as, ready for this, my predecessors as applied historians. For the last 40 years, my career has centered on applied history, and because of my location here, the University of Colorado has been recognized as a base of operations for the project of turning hindsight into foresight, inserting historical perspective into contemporary dilemmas and conflicts in hopes of challenging stalemate and resolving problems. So, Jody, thank you for giving me the opportunity to discover that I am directly tied to my predecessor, Colin Goodykoontz, who I never knew a thing about until you invited me to pay attention. And now I have a predecessor. So, Professor Goodykoontz wrote about the determination of the founders of the nation to find guidance in history and to apply that guidance in the designing of the Constitution. It's a really interesting speech. I will not be summarizing it, but I urge you to look at it. But the conclusion of the presidential speech provides the biggest reason why I now claim him as my predecessor. In the conclusion of this speech, remember, delivered in 1953, Goodykoontz spoke very directly about the danger of nuclear war, and he expressed the hope that historians could be useful in preventing that unimaginable calamity. I'm quoting at a little bit of length here from him because it's not fair to just paraphrase him. The President of the United States has within the month reminded the whole world in the most solemn words of the awful consequences of impending atomic warfare. And remember, the hydrogen bomb was in existence by this point. The possibility, still quoting from the President, the possibility of civilization destroyed, the annihilation of the irreplaceable heritage of mankind handed down from generation to generation. Has history any contribution to make in this hour of peril? Is there time for history to mediate among unfriendly peoples and cultures by explaining one to the other? Obviously, I'm still quoting him. Will the people or leaders listen now to voices from the past telling how men have learned to live together and to respect one another's rights to divergent political systems, religious beliefs, social and economic organizations? How far are we from the precipice? If close, that's all the more reason for urgency of effort to hold mankind back from the abyss. Back for a moment to the Founding Fathers and their problem in government. It was not in vain that they sought the help of the muse of history. History gave them perspective, enabled them better to balance the advantages of the old and the new, and provided them with the information on which they could decide more wisely as to the next step forward. These are among history's greatest services to mankind. They are still good answers to the old question, what is history good for? Among its many uses, history has the power, along with religion, philosophy, literature, and the arts, to lift the spirit of man as if it were to a mountaintop from which he can then more clearly take his bearings in a time of change and confusion. 1953, just going to say, my judgment, pretty darn relevant, 2026. So, just to accent what everyone has realized, in 1953, Professor Colin Goodykoontz affirmed the obligation of historians to pursue opportunities to extend their reach beyond academia and to apply history to support the most consequential of causes. And now we get to the aspects of Professor Goody. I shouldn't really be chuckling, but I think you'll see that's sort of the spirit I'm bringing to a serious subject here. And now we get to the aspect of Professor Goodykoontz's career that makes me struggle for an agility required to perform that intellectual exercise called mixed judgment. Professor Goodykoontz wrote a thoughtful and instructive essay on the nation's founders, and that essay was largely a celebration of their achievements. And yet it is important to note that this was not an adulterated celebration, and he did interrupt celebration a few times to note their omissions and episodes of inattention to issues of consequence, leading to some dilemmas down the road. But here is where my admiration for his essay hits a speed bump. This essay is a classic demonstration of how to study the founders and their quest for institutions that would foster and protect freedom while not taking even a moment to observe that many of the founders were slaveholders. Now, obviously, in the constitutional debates that came up, but Goodykoontz seems not to have found those aspects of the debates worth a notice. 3/5 vision, none of that. But now, note the irony of timing. Professor Goodykoontz gave the speech in 1953. It was published in May of 1954. The Supreme Court issued its judgment in Brown versus Board of Education in May of 1954, the same time that the speech was published. If the nominating committee, let's fault them, if the nominating committee of the American Historical Association Pacific Coast Branch had waited 1 year in their selection of a president in his run, then Goodykoontz's run as an applied historian addressing one aspect of his time, the prospect of nuclear wars, might likely have been, in the applied historian manner, been nudged by the Supreme Court decisions. Would that timing have called his attention to the Constitution's delay in reckoning fully with slavery? So now for the performance of mixed judgment, and I'm really so grateful to you for the chance to, I've never done this. I've said in public, I shall now try a balance beam and I may fall off, but you judge it. Okay. I wish that my predecessor at the University of Colorado had paused as he finished the manuscript of his presidential address to examine and correct a major blind spot in his thinking about the founders. But I am standing by my pride in having him as my predecessor in applied history, my predecessor at the University of Colorado. After years of experimenting with mixed judgment, I have deliberated on what constitutes success. How do we calibrate success? And here's my opinion. Success in mixed judgment is certified when everyone who is not enthusiastic about mixed judgment finds me compromised and spineless. Victory. Which I have, this is the first time I've used the phrase mixed judgment in a public audience, but I've certainly tried to perform it in spineless and compromise. Here's my greatest hope, though. When historians engage in mixed judgment, I would hope that we are then led to scope out, we are positioned, we are required to scope out our own blind spots and our own omissions and our own inattention to what will turn out to be perfectly obvious to our successors. So, the point, the congruence between Professor Goodykoontz and me as holders of the faith, and I use that word intentionally, that historians can be helpful far beyond the borders of academia, requires me to acknowledge him as my predecessor. When he spoke as the president of the American Historical Association Pacific Coast Branch and urged his fellow historians to direct their best efforts to preventing nuclear war, he took a frontline leadership role in the cause of applied history. Last semester, I taught CU's first applied history course for undergraduates, and I am teaching a revised and improved version of that course this semester. It is great that Helen's Hall has been wondrously remodeled, but it would have been great to teach that course in the old seminar room named after Colin Goodykoontz. We don't know for sure if that name has survived, and we can go chalk it in, I suppose, or maybe even come in the night with spray paint, except we can't get in the buildings at night, so we can't do that. So, okay. Now, to repeat what is obvious to everyone tonight, I have found entirely unexpected kinship with my predecessor at CU, who I never paid an ounce of attention to until he told me to wake up. Now, to discuss my hidden agenda in these remarks and in what follows, I am inviting you into my world, and I'm trying to reveal the intense human drama and the amusement and charm concealed in one of the world's dullest words: historiography. Well, no one just yawned, but I don't know why. So it is a term that might win the competition for the dreariest word of 6 syllables or more. And now for what I hope will be a somewhat moving example of the human drama of intergenerational change that historiography means. So I know this: I am really well positioned to tell you something that I'm not sure many other people could tell you. Colin Goodykoontz was a talent scout for emerging Western historians in the late 40s and early 1950s. I know this because a half century later, I encountered the people he talent scouted when they were just getting started. I encountered them as my predecessors and elders. So I'm going to just tell a couple of stories just to say, boy, historiography, almost more stimulation than you can bear sometimes with the intensity of it. Okay, so Colin Goodykoontz reviewed Henry Nash Smith's book, Virgin Land, in 1951, the year that I was born, probably. After a definitely picky, and this is where you could get confused, I think, about what his relationship to Turner was. After a definitively picky critique of what Henry Nash Smith wrote about Frederick Jackson Turner, it's very weird. He uses the passive voice. It's not like him at all, but he is really standing up for his mentor, it seems like, in that passage. Then, after he did that, Professor Goodykoontz declared that Smith's book was, quote, an outstanding achievement in scholarship, a penetrating analysis of the ideas that grew up about the West. Very Colin Goodykoontz to make that kind remark, to go through nitpicking. He's quite an expert nitpicker of books, but then he always comes in at the end with a younger scholar and does what he just did there. Okay, so jump forward 2 decades. I read Virgin Land. I write a fan letter to Henry Nash Smith. I meet him. He turns out to be very enjoyable, really a great friend. Young people write fan letters. He writes back to say, I really rarely get such things so long after the book has come out and it's going to be good and that much. So it turned out to be great. He's really a funny storyteller. He told me a wonderful story that I just sums up everything about nostalgia and changing times. He grew up in Dallas. He told us a story. We were visiting some very interesting people. He said he went back to where he grew up in Dallas. He wanted to go to the neighborhood. He wanted to be where he'd grown up. And it had turned into a parking lot next to an office building. So this is so Henry Nash Smith. What to do? He paid to get in the parking lot, and he drove to the space that was closest to where his house would have been, his bedroom. And he parked in the parking place for his. So that was so fun to be with Henry Nash Smith and his taking that story and wrapping it into our nostalgia and how it works out. That was great. One more. Goodykoontz reviewed Eugene Holland's biography of Zebulon Pike in 1949. Gene Holland went on and wrote a book about deserts, attitudes towards deserts. That was the subject of my first book. I got to know Gene Holland through that. Okay, so after noting that Gene Holland had, boy, you want to see nitpicking? Goodykoontz could do it. He notes that Gene Holland confused, in writing about Zebulon Pike's expedition, he confused Fahrenheit temperatures with the readings from a Reamer thermometer, whatever that is. Is that an eye for detail? Just to say, okay, let's not go over thermometers just now. But then he ended the review with a characteristic, generous conclusion. We are informed by the publisher that this is Dr. Holland's first book-length publication. He has made a good start. His future contributions will be awaited with interest. That's not totally normal to be so scrupulous in sending the young person off with a bit of a limp, but then a sort of, that was a nice man. Okay, so jump forward 35 years. Gene Holland was the commentator at the first session where I gave a presentation at the Western History Association. He too was a great storyteller, and he told a story at the session that I have gotten so much use out of, and I'll give it to you because you might want to use it, about the West as a place of health, that we want to come to the West, as Goodykoontz himself did, I guess. Anyway, Goodykoontz was long gone by the time I heard the story from Gene Holland. So Gene Holland told a story at that session, 1983, about an old fellow in Arkansas who was quite frail. He's not doing well at all. His health was very bad. And the doctor finally said to him, I don't think there's anything I can do for you. I've tried everything I can do, but I think the only hope is for you to move to the West and healthier climate, and maybe a healthier climate would work. You could try Santa Fe. Maybe you should try Santa Fe. So the old fellow packed up and he moved to Santa Fe, but well, too late. Health declined, kept going downhill, and he passed away. They transported his body back to Arkansas. They had an open casket funeral. They'd moved fast on this, and his old pals were at the viewing, and two pals stood and looked at the coffin, and they looked at their old friend, and one said to the other, "Don't he look good?" And the other one said, "Santa Fe done him a world of good." Gene Holland was just a cascade of those stories. I so kicked myself for not having the sense to have kept a notepad whenever I was with him. And then there's a pretty touching little aspect here. So Gene Holland became angry at the Western History Association over something. I don't know what, but he was really mad. When I was president of the association, Western History Association, I wrote Gene and persuaded him to come back, which he'd been boycotting over some miffdom. He came. So I spent a great deal of my presidential conference pushing Gene Holland's wheelchair. So, boy, historiography is really boring, isn't it? Really, really boring. The sequence, one last round of this, the sequence of Harvard and Turner. So it looks like Colin Goodykoontz was one of Turner's last students, leaving just before Turner left Harvard. I wondered if he had wanted, you so answered this question for me, I wondered if Colin Goodykoontz had aspired to be the Turner successor. Could he have wanted to be in Turner's place at Harvard, and he ended up here? I wondered about that, and everything you said about small, keep it small. So Frederick Merck was the Turner protégé who ended up becoming Turner's successor. So Turner was at Harvard from 1910 to 1922. Goodykoontz left Harvard in 1921, one of the last of Turner's students. Frederick Merck became Turner's successor as the Western historian at Harvard from 1924 until 1956. Then we had a gap. And then, in 1980, I became the third in that genealogy. So, Turner, Merck, Limerick, which is so preposterous. I mean, it's just so funny, so hilarious. And then Lois Merck, Professor Merck had passed away, but Lois Merck caught the same bus that I took from Park Circle in Arlington into Harvard Square. So Mrs. Merck and I were often on the bus together, and she was quite deaf, and so bus riders had to hear a lot about historiography. They had to hear Mrs. Merck telling me stories about her husband. It was quite wonderful, and me responding and so on. And I want to say this in terms of challenging stereotypes. Lois Merck always stayed after me to tell her where she should be contributing to good causes that would help American Indian people. Not the stereotype we would have had there. So that's what I wanted to say. You've already talked about Jen Ships for historiography. Jen Ships, PhD from here, endlessly indefatigable in haranguing all of us Western historians to pay attention to religion. Just absolutely without mercy on that. Mercy is a religious value, but she did not show that mercy when she told us how bad we'd been in leaving out our religion and that. So what a great impact she had on us. So the point that I hope you will consider from those stories is that historians are so intertwined, or at least we used to be so intertwined, that we are, or were, I'm not sure which, perfectly set up to set a model for academic world, but for society on productive disagreement and mixed judgments. An opportunity we sometimes take, but could take a lot more often, and we would, I think, be aligned with the Goodykoontz review conclusion, where you tear at the book for a paragraph or two, and then you say, this author's a good author. So, okay, so that's pretty much what I wanted to speak of. I wanted to mention one other CU tradition that we might note, and I was very confused when first message, oh yes, my predecessor, Colin Goodykoontz, oh yes, that was a seminar room, there's a door there. And then I think, oh yes, I think I might have heard of him. Well, wrong person. So, in 1973, a historian at the University of Colorado gave a speech at the Western History Association. I did not attend, but my advisor told us all that there had been quite an uproar over this presentation that the University of Colorado professor had given. It was not Colin Goodykoontz. It was Clifford Westermeyer. And Clifford Westermeyer was at CU from 1964 to 1978. He retired just 6 years before I arrived, and he died in 1986. I've been here 2 years. I never met him, but I had heard about the controversy. What was his paper in 1973? Cowboy Sexuality, a Historical No-No. 1973, different time, total uproar. And I don't know, do we want to do a symposium on a little event on him? He was a very interesting person, but that's just, it's so interesting to have been here for so many years paying no attention to those predecessors. Then, this really would be, I think this is a concluding remark I thought I really had to give, to leap ahead and answer a question nobody's likely to ask. When my cohort arrived in the mid-1980s of new assistant professors, folklore quickly oriented us to the fact that we had joined a very divided department. Folklore did not tell us when that fragmentation and polarization had entered the picture, so I have nothing to offer in the way of insight into the habitat in which Professor Goodykoontz found himself. If he only did one term as department chair, that might tell us something, maybe not. But I do know, and this is the concluding remark I wanted to make, I do know that hiring has gone wonderfully in the last couple of decades, and the history department serves as the home for a very impressive talent pool. That's it.
Well, Patty and I thought we might talk amongst ourselves and then take some questions from the audience, if that sounds good.
Sure. I do have to just quickly ask, why are you so certain that it was Goodykoontz saying, I'm seeing more to this narrative? And I am willing to concede, but I thought it was that the sources at the Chicago Theological Seminary were just making it impossible for him to be a loyal.
What made you think that?
Because Turner, what he is known for is making, what you said, big, grandiose.
No, he's a terrible simplifier, and he makes grand statements. I called him a perpetual hyperbolist.
Yeah.
But you read him knowing that. I mean, you know his rhetorical techniques. I wondered what in your look at Goodykoontz gave you the idea that he was simply incapable of dealing with the magnitude of the archives.
Oh, no, that he was changed and made a rebel by the magnitude of the archives. Oh. But I guess what I would also just say, maybe this is the most important thing to say, that how we are to be the right kind of loyal protégés to our mentors is not clear. Right?
Yeah, he's not going to denounce. He's not going to slay the father figure.
Sometimes that happens.
It does.
Harold Bloom's
always for
Anxiety of Influence book.
Yeah. Walter Jackson Bate had one in that same era.
Is that right?
Called The Burden of the Past in the English Poet. And it's about this,
how do you...
Goethe once said, who spent some time in England, Goethe once said that he was so grateful that he was writing in German and not in English, because it meant he didn't have to deal with Shakespeare.
Right.
With the burden of having Shakespeare behind you. He could be the Shakespeare of German. And so, have been Oedipal figures who slay their metaphorical fathers.
Right.
Always, I think, to ill effect. I prefer
That probably doesn't go so well,
Goodykoontz's.
yeah.
I prefer Goodykoontz's non-rebellious tenderness for his mentor at the same time that he was taking a different path.
Right.
I
Right.
find that much more admirable.
Right.
And I was entirely serious when I ended the very first paragraph of my talk by saying that Goodykoontz lived what I think is an admirable life.
Quite.
He lived small, he taught, he thought, he recycled bottles and drove his old Studebaker.
Where did he
and
take the
still
recycling
had,
in the 1950s? That was fascinating. It's an historical question. There's no place in the 1950s to take. Oh, you could buy deposit
right,
bottles.
exactly.
Okay.
But he would
Recycling
also,
bins. This is not a very important question,
but he'd drive his old Studebaker around and still, left what in today is maybe $210,000 to Northern Library in his will.
Yeah.
And I think it's a sweet life, and a good life, and it was very Congregationalist. It was a certain form of American Protestantism that derived ultimately from puritanical roots of living small, and of course we see rebirths of it even today, non-religious typically, but of that sense of a slight suspicion when you see someone who wants to stand athwart the world stage shouting greatness and shouting great theses. And Turner's and Goodykoontz is a little.
That's not him. Yeah.
That he doesn't want to do that, and he's slightly suspicious of those who do. At the same time, he is very solicitous of Turner, because Turner was his father.
Did he ever speak of his faith in class, do you think, or do you have any evidence in the archive that he did?
No.
Because I did, 20 years ago, I had a symposium, a small conference on religion in the American West. And I was mad because there was quite an uproar that American Civil Liberties Union was angry because the coach at that time of the basketball team would sometimes have his players pray beforehand. The Jewish players said they didn't mind that, but ACLU was, I guess, suing the coach for that. And I thought, oh, for heaven's sake, can we do that some other time? So at the end of our symposium on religion, we had a public program, and I asked the moderator, sent a little note and said, could we have a benediction? And we had an African-American minister who's getting a PhD in history, Senator Blair. I said, could we have Reverend Blair just do a benediction? So I went into total rebellion against the separation of church and state and being at a secular university, and I had us conclude a program with a benediction. And she did it perfectly, very non-denominational and so on. So that just makes me wonder if, when you were talking about him being such a man of faith, did he have to conceal that or separate it or just not say the certain words?
I think he lived a quite unified life. The faith was something manifest in him. He was not proselytizing. He was not a proselytizer at all. But he was, the son of a pastor, deeply involved in the First Congregational Church here in Boulder, Colorado, and enough so that he felt it his duty when they showed him the papers they had. He felt it his duty to organize the papers for them and write a small history of the church because, that was his charism, his gift. And the church needed it because the papers were a disaster. And he was a professional. So like a professional carpenter would have come in and repaired the pews, he was the professional historian who came in and fixed up their papers and their archives for them. And I think, but this is where I'm kind of surprised, Patty, that you dwelt on the rivalry of the denominations. Because this is the story of America in the 19th century. This is, now I dealt with this as a Catholic, looking at it from the outside. My book, An Anxious Age, is deeply involved in this question of the rival Protestant denominations and how America got benefits from that. In other words, because we don't have an established church, because where it would have been the Episcopalians, the Methodists fought against it, and where it would have been the Congregationalists, the Presbyterians fought against it. And we ended up, I argue, in America through much of the 19th century in the peculiar place of having the equivalent of a state church, the benefits of a state church for civility and stability of culture, without the negatives of a state church, because, as Tocqueville says, though they differ wildly in their doctrinal points and battle bitterly, in all questions of manners and morals, they form a single current. These rival Protestant sects. And so we got the manners and morals benefits of a state church without the negatives of a state church because of these rival Protestant sects. Goodykoontz would have simply taken this as the air that he breathed. If he doesn't talk about it, it is what in the Commedia dell'arte they call a secret de Polichinelle. A secret that's only a secret because everybody assumes you already know it, so they don't tell you about it. It was just that very air that he breathed that these rival denominations. Now, the missionary movement is going to do a lot of damage to these rivalries. You know, when you've got to remember these missionaries, first to the West and then to Asia, particularly Africa and Asia, these were the best and brightest. These were the sharpest kids, the most morally serious kids. In the 1970s, it was said that the number one shared characteristic of people in Who's Who, still a small share, right? But the number one was children of missionaries to the Far East. Because these sharp, serious young people went there, they married each other, and their kids came home and took over America from Henry Luce on. And this is, it seems to me, the missionary movements, which are going to become the most prestigious things in the mission boards, are going to become the most prestigious parts of all these denominations. They're going to break down a lot of this denominational rivalry eventually. And that, I think, Goodykoontz would have seen. The National Council of Churches is, for instance, a kind of a combining of them. And Eisenhower in 1953, the same Eisenhower who's being lectured by Goodykoontz about nuclear war, he's president in 1953, Eisenhower flies up to New York and lays the cornerstone of the National Council of Churches building as president. This Protestantism was, and these rivalries, was very much America. It was our story. Goodykoontz wouldn't have found it exceptional at all or confusing.
Well, the reviewer says it's the first item.
Right, that there is this, this rivalry.
Right, but just stay away from the Whitmans, because if you start paying attention to the Whitmans, you will never see missionaries in that sort of, well, they're just waiting to work together mode. They were Presbyterians, and they were, so I don't know that I see them as in some way that they may not even have, well, maybe, okay, maybe that's it. In a way they were not aware of, they were coming together, I guess.
Right, especially in the Far East.
Well, okay. So one of the great things about knowing him is that you don't ever have to read any classic literature anymore because he has read it all. So this was so, when we sat down, I thought I was going to quote from T.S. Eliot. And it turns out I was trying to quote from Yeats, which is lamentable. And possibly I should have degrees revoked for that kind of moment. But the great part with him is that, again, I don't have to read either Yeats or Eliot or anybody else because he is just so supplied to go on every imaginable topic. And that is probably not a good transition to say, how do your protégés deal with you? That's probably not the right transition because you do cover so much territory that to be a young person saying, look what I found out, that can't be the easiest thing because you have thought about so much.
Question?
Yeah.
Well, I guess that was kind of a question.
Yeah, why don't we turn to any questions from the audience? No?
How about you, Taylor? You thought it would be good to have questions. Do you want to?
Do I have a question?
Uh-huh.
I have a question. So setting aside like the the details of religion in the West and the frontier thesis, it strikes me that there's a contrast between Turner as described and Goodykoontz as described in terms of their approaches. That that Turner was bolder, and that Goodykoontz was more careful. And it seems like careful is what describes, the historians today, professional historians today. And bold is not always what describes them.
Well,
but then I feel like there was much more sympathy for Goodykoontz in the story that unwound here. But he was doing the less ambitious thing. I don't know. Is there a tension there, or?
Well, I think I'm going to.
More people should be like Turner, or less people should be like Turner.
And I think it is important to say that Turner was. He expressed himself in a lot of different ways, and the vast statement was one thing. He also sort of seen in some ways as the pioneer of social history, and is there data we can, and Frederick Merck certainly had picked that up from him. So Turner was many people. He also was very much engaged as a public intellectual, and I don't know how much Goodykoontz actually, if he did more than say, historians try to stand in the way of nuclear war, try to keep that from happening. I don't know if he had any particular idea about how he might do it. And I don't think he was lecturing Eisenhower. I think he was saying, Eisenhower said something to us, we better take it to heart and see if we can help. But I have no idea if he actually, did the Congregationalists in Boulder organize to express concern about nuclear war, and was he part of that? I mean, I have no idea what there actually was, but boy, did he tell those historians to be applied historians. That's an amazing conclusion there, and I don't know that might be part of why. I guess what he was so clearly doing with those conclusions, the reviews, he was saying to historians, you have every right to self-esteem. Don't let it get out of control. Don't let it become vaunting and vast, but recognize you are an asset, and you have a service to perform. I really would love to know if there's any testimony from his students about what he was like there, because it seems like he did totally believe that historians have a reason to be. As he says in the quotation I read, what is the good of history? Here are the answers. Look at that was so interesting, because he was saying, look at what the founders did to read history before they jumped into action. Let's do that ourselves.
I think, though, Taylor, that carefulness and precision and cautiousness, which are hallmarks of a modern academic, Goodykoontz came to that not from a well-established idea of what later a professional historian would look like, but because it fit his natural character. Right? He was suspicious of the grand. Remember Turner's frontier thesis paper, the one that he made famous, and he pursued fame hard.
Oh, he sent it to Wilson. He sent it to Roosevelt.
He was a self-promoter, but it's still 19th century. It's the very end of the 19th century. And the 19th century was an era of grand theses. This is the age of Hegel. This is the age of Marx. This is the age of the great grand theory of it all. Remember, George Eliot mocks it in one of her novels as a man Casaubon writing a book called The Key to All Mythologies. It's this grand sort of statement, this grand idea. And although Turner comes at the end of it, he's still sort of trying to speak grand things in that mode. Goodykoontz is much younger and has a temperament that aims at living small. And he finds a kind of precision and the kindness that Patty saw in his reviews of young people. He finds they merge easily with this new professionalism. But that's not a bad thing.
Goodness, no.
But on the other hand, you know, as a reader of America, right? Because that's all I am, you know, in this stuff. I'd read Parkman. I'd read Turner. I didn't read Goodykoontz, right? He wasn't, you know, writing The Oregon Trail or 2 Years
Right.
Before the Mast or any of these once standard books of Americana.
Yeah.
He was trying to puzzle out something small or something in a small way. And I admire that. And that's why I began by saying I actually admire this man who lived this small life. But also, I want to say, you know, I can't advise you to read anything of his. I mean, if you're a professional historian or deeply involved in the
presidential
topic,
speech.
you know, but maybe. But, you know, he's not something that we're going to read if you're going to be a well-read person in Americana.
True. So I would like to ask the group a question, which is my little exercise, and if you won't ask us questions, then we'll just turn that around here. So, you had your, but I just want to quickly ask, because it would be really interesting to me, my little performance of mixed judgment, of saying that I am proud to have him as a sister, and I will not look away from his capacity, which seems really peculiar to me, to not even mention the word slavery as he celebrates the protection of freedom that the founders are creating. That just makes me think, hey, just
And
read
Patty, I get off the boat there. I mean, I admired all the story. I loved all the stories you told and so on. But I don't think we can criticize people easily.
I wanted to ask them, if I could just interrupt for a second.
Let me
Yeah.
put this in play. We can't criticize people by talking about what they didn't talk about. He talked about slavery elsewhere. He reviewed many books about slavery. If you mean the presidential address is somehow vitiated and weakened by its failure to mention slavery, then, you know, our praise for the University of Colorado today is vitiated by our not mentioning the many physics Nobel Prize winners. I mean, you can't criticize by what they don't
I feel
mention.
misrepresented a bit here, because what I'm trying to say here is that I am trying to find a stance towards this man that permits me to have a mixed judgment, to think there are elements here I admire tremendously. There are elements that make me think this is not an inspiration to me. This is not. I'm not going to go after his estate and have the Congregational Church condemn him as he is now. I mean, that's silly. There's none of that. It's just that I am trying to say, couldn't we all do more of that rather than what we have now, which is if we find a flaw in a person, a lot of people in universities will carry a person to the trash heap of history if a flaw is shown. If some kind of intemperate remark is made or a dismissive remark about someone, that speaker or writer is then carried to the trash heap of history. I hate that. So don't accuse me of that kind of thing. I am not doing that. I'm saying I can see both of these things at once, and I can say 5 or 6 more things about what I think I would always want to say, how fortunate I am to be in his line of succession, and how I would like us at least to do a little bit more of looking at our blind spots than he did on that particular occasion. Can we just do that? So I'm actually, I think, trying to say, let's not do overwrought condemnations. Let's not think we have to have, that there's some, you know, oh, that darn Emerson. I'm going to quote Emerson, I think, and wait, hobgoblin, who knows who I'm quoting, but that a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of petty minds?
It's Thoreau.
What?
That was Thoreau. A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. Yeah, that's Thoreau.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that.
Why don't we take one last question? Yeah.
It's actually exactly about this point that you raised. And I'm not going even to mention on the slavery. I think that you respond to this point about slavery really well. But even to the methodology of asking someone and criticize someone about the blind spot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If you go to every single, the greatest minds in humankind, the whole civilization, you're going to find, you're going to find blind spots in every single one of them. All of them had blind spots because they didn't know things that we know now.
Of course.
And it seems to me that's not a good exercise in academic. It's not a good exercise in criticizing a person that maybe Newton, maybe Einstein, Aristotle, Plato, that they didn't know what to know. And actually, and so I think that this is not a good methodology to criticize people. But even besides this, you can go for about blind spots today, because it seems that we have this perception that we got to the pinnacle of moral comprehension. You can go back in history and judge everyone. To go back to people that lived 200, 500 years ago and judge them and what they did with the values that we have today.
I agree with you completely. I agree with you completely.
From 50, 100 years from now, wouldn't this thinkers there would not think about this, about the blind spots that we have today?
I couldn't agree with everything you say. I agree with completely. I have had an unusual experience personally of being alive and having written a book like Sea of Conquest where people have lined up to point out my blind spots, and it has been great. I have so enjoyed it. I cannot tell you how many times this has happened where someone is Limerick neglects or Limerick overlooks or Limerick, and I think, well, I did. It's a great experience. There's nothing wrong with having someone point out that you have a less than complete understanding of something. It's a great experience. It helps if you're alive. Although a lot of people hate it when they're alive. I don't know why they do, because it's very fun. There are books that begin with Limerick fails to, that's not the first sentence necessarily, but I thought, very soon I thought, I am like the side of a pool that people could push off from and have more momentum from that. So I think that's where to take people as ridiculously fragile that's silly. To have somebody say, Patty, you overlooked, are there no cities in that book, in Legacy of Conquest? It's terrible. John Finley pointed that out. Grateful for the rest of my days that he pointed that out in a public review. There's nothing wrong with saying to somebody, there's more there. It's actually taking them seriously, joining with them. I don't know what to say if they're dead and they can't say, I think you're right, or I appreciate you mentioning that. If they're dead and they can't speak, that's bad, I guess. But if they're dead, they can't be heard. Is that right? Okay, okay, stopping there. I'm not quoting Emerson ever again in my life. I'm just through with that.